who is the greatest among you. Let him be servant of all. There is a sin that is very destructive, often hidden. It is known only sometimes by people in the family. Rarely is it demonstrated at church. But it's a devastating sin that can be true in the life of a leader. We are going to look at a Bible example of that today. And James chapter 1 and verse 19, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man works not the righteousness of God." I want to speak today on the topic of anger. And I want to take the life of a great leader, in fact, in my opinion, the greatest leader of the Old Testament. And yet, if that were true of him, how much I need to guard that emotion in my own life, and that is the sin of anger. I'd like us to go back to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20, if you are able to follow in your Bibles, I want to work through the testimony of Moses. What happened to him? Why could he not enter into Canaan after so much battling with the people, so much arguing with God in the early part of his calling? Anger is an emotion, according to Dr. Redford Williams of Duke Medical School. Anger is an emotion that is more destructive than smoking, drinking, overeating, and so on. Anger produces a high stress hormone that burns out our bodies. There's a rightful anger and there is a wrong anger. And today I want to consider the elements of wrong anger. In another segment, we will do something what would be true of those who have a righteous anger, true, of course, of the Lord Jesus himself. But I want to take what happened to Moses. Number one, I want to look at the cause of anger. And then I want to look at the countenance of anger. What does it really look like before we get to the calamity that it causes and then the cure for anger? But first of all, let's look at the causes of anger as we look in Numbers chapter 20. Chapter 20 and verse 1 of Numbers, "Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there." Underscore that, and Miriam died there. So the first cause of anger that we see in this context is personal pain. Now Miriam, obviously, when you look back in the life of Moses, the older sister of Moses, the one who was responsible in God's plan to preserve the life of Moses so that Moses could be taken into Pharaoh's palace and protected for the cause that God had for him. But Miriam died. And there had to be a close relationship, as you remember the role that she played in so many portions of the life of Moses. Even criticized who he was dating, typical older sister for a younger man. But what happened here is she has died. When you look at the people who are seething sometimes in anger, there is a deep, deep personal pain that is going on within. I was doing a men's conference out in Wyoming, snowmobile retreat actually, and there were 100 men with their snowmobiles. We had to ride the snowmobiles up to the top of the mountain. We were up in the Tetons, and a man who owned a construction company came to me, and he said, I brought a man. I brought one of my men. I'm paying for his fee here, and I'm paying for 2 days of work for him to come, but he is not a believer. His name is Bill. And he said, so be aware that Bill is here. And I was very conscious of that. I would watch Bill while I was speaking, and he would look down, he would not look up. And then after my second session, the owner of that construction company came and said, you know, Bill was taking a lot of notes and writing a lot when you were speaking in that last session. I think he wants to talk to you. Well, I waited for Bill to come to me. Bill did not come to me. And so I thought I will look for an opportunity to talk with him. So before my last session, Bill was sitting up against that back wall, and I pulled up a chair, went to him, and said, Bill, I'm honored that you are here, and what a privilege for me to be able to be speaking to you at this conference. I heard you might want to talk to me. He said, I do, but I don't want to offend you. He said, you said on the opening service that we are sinners and that we need to be saved. He said, no, God is a sinner. And he shoved this paper in front of my face. He said, put that in your anger file. And Bill took this paper and he said, read that and put that in your anger file, because I illustrated in this session on anger that I have a file that people have written notes. And here's what Bill had on his thing. He said, what do you say to a man who watched his mother suffer from a 40-foot fall? I was 5 years old. Watched his father die from a brain tumor. I was 7 years old. Watched his sister become a heroin addict. I was 10 years old. Saw his puppy get hit by a car and die. I was 13 years old. Who prayed that I would never see my grandmother suffer. I watched her when the paramedics came in to do CPR. She died. And who thinks God is a sinner. That's what he pushed into my face. Now, then he said, and there's more. Who prayed that his mom would not suffer and took her years. He did not. She suffered, and I suffered watching her. Whose nephew died at age 30. There is still more. Thank you for your time, Dr. Les. Interestingly enough, he signed his name Bill and the last name on the bottom and gave me his email address. I said, Bill, do you realize God is not angry with you? Do you realize that God understands the pain that you're going through? Do you understand, Bill, that the only one who loves you with a perfect love, you're pushing out of your life, angry at the only one who can solve the dilemma that you have in your life? And I said, you are loved with a perfect love. I preached that session. I was told by the camp director that we had to get things loaded into the snowmobile trailers and the sleds that were behind them, and said, we'll have to get down to the main highway as soon as you are done preaching. I finished that last meeting, and I was walking toward my cabin in the deep snow, and I right behind me, Bill was following me. And I turned, and Bill grabbed me and hugged me, lifted me up right off my feet. And I said, Bill, God loves you, I love you, and your boss loves you. He said, I know that. But what happened, I said, Bill, don't push the only one who can help you out of your life. I checked with the men last year to see if Bill had ever come to Christ, and they said, as far as they know, he still had not come to Christ. But there was a tenderizing going on in the heart. Bill is only one example. When I do a session on bitterness, I think we're going to see a lot of other illustrations that illustrate the fact that we in life go through some real deep personal pain. I don't know what you might be going through. You may be going through some very deep pressures. It might be a family issue. It might be a health issue. It might be a rejection. It might be an abandonment. Maybe the husband or the mate walked out. But there's personal pain that has come. I could go through many, many more illustrations of that fact. And then secondly, we see a cause of anger was people pressure. Not only personal pain causes this kind of a dilemma, but there's people pressure. Look in verse 2 of Numbers 20, and there was no water for the congregation, and they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people chode with Moses and spake, saying, Would God we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. In other words, they come and chode here doesn't mean they just said, Moses, come here, I'd like to share something privately with you. They were literally screaming at Moses. Why did you lead us to this place? You brought us out in the desert to die. We had it made in Egypt. People pressure. And you might be at work. There might be a man at work who is a real pain to you. I knew a man said he knew a man would make coffee nervous. That is people pressure. He said there are people who God brings into the life to bring that kind of pressure to you. So here's Moses, called of God to take the children of Israel from Egypt to Canaan. And yet all he faced was complaining and griping and murmuring and complaining about everything that Moses was doing. And the people chode with him. Those of you who are in leadership positions know the difficulties sometimes that you face in that role as a leader. And many times you're burning within your own self with the passion of wonder, why am I having to face all of this? And so you see just in the beginning of this chapter, the pain that was faced, the people pressure that he faced. And now secondly, let's look at the countenance of anger. What did this look like in the life of Moses? In verse 7, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, speak unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. Note that, speak to the rock. And thou shalt bring forth water to them out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beast drink. God gave him very clear instruction. You remember earlier, God told him to smite the rock. Now he said, speak to the rock. So Moses took the rod that was before the Lord, and as he commanded him, he took the rod, and Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock. And he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels. First face of anger we see is the sarcastic words. One of the things that we as dads particularly have to face. We see maybe a character flaw forming in a child, and we start using very cutting, sarcastic words. The very essence of sarcasm is cutting. And we use cutting words. Zero with the ring rubbed out, and worthless, and lazy, and we start throwing out these words in haste and in anger, and become very, very devastating in that kind of a circumstance. Sarcastic words, and how we need to guard the words that come out of the mouth. How many times I have been guilty of this in a stage of frustration and trying to bring about an accurate correction into the life of the child, and the tendency to use words that are very harmful and very cutting. One of the hardest things to do as a husband many times is to control your tongue, that you do not let bitterness show forth in your words that would come. Then secondly, we see a very self-centered focus. And he said, must we fetch water from you out of the rock? I don't know what the we was. It was God who brought the water, but Moses comes and says, must we fetch water out of the rock for you? And self-centered focus. One of the big tendencies that causes anger is that someone has made a decision, someone has made a choice that has inconvenienced me. I remember when our daughter Tammy was in school, and Tammy had never never giving us a minute's trouble. I walked from our home on campus where we lived over to the dining hall. I noticed that there was a very thin layer of snow over ice. It had rained, frozen, and then snowed on top of that. And I noticed in that time that it could be very dangerous on the roads. And we had a van at that time that was very bad on snow. And I said, Tammy, be careful, because she picked up kids from campus and took them to Faith Christian School there in Pembine. And I said, Tammy, be very careful, because it's very slippery out there, and it doesn't look icy, but it is. And she said, I'll be very careful. And we had about 200 plus guests on campus for a basketball tournament, and I had to change my normal morning schedule, and I was speaking in chapel that morning. And I was in the shower, and my son Stephen came back, running back with his book bag on his back. He said, Dad, we're in the ditch. I said, where? He said, just up around that first corner. And I said, well, I'll get the Bronco. And he said, no, not the Bronco, Dad. We are in the ditch. So I went over to maintenance and got the payloader, and I got a logging chain and got the payloader. And I went out the gate, and I saw the van there, and Tammy and the others had already been picked up and were on the way. And I was beginning to do kind of a slow burn. I thought to myself, I didn't stutter when I told Tammy it was icy. I thought I was very clear. I was talking to myself now. And when I hooked the logging chain onto the Reese hitch on the van, I took the payloader bucket. I was going to lift the back end of the van up and take it out like a wheelbarrow, but there was a small aspen tree that was in the way, so I'm not going to go into the process of what it took to get that aspen tree down with this chainsaw that someone brought that quit running halfway through. And I was now working myself up into a lather. And I thought of all the ridiculous things I have to deal with now. And I was having to go and speak at chapel at 9 o'clock. And why now this? And so I pulled the van out after I got the tree down, and the left front tire was blown, and I lifted the front of the van up with the payloader and changed that tire, put that tire on, but I was still doing a slow burn. Got the thing down. A young man who had been in our youth group years ago was now pastoring. He had been a guest on campus. I took him with me, and I said, Reed, can anybody tell that it's icy out here? And he was not saying a word. He was just watching my demonstration. I got the payloader parked back at the shop. I was now sweating. I had my snowmobile suit on. I had everything there. Took it off. I got to the house to start getting ready. Went into the kitchen. My wife was in there. And I said, honey, did you hear me tell Tammy it was icy? And she said, yes. I said, did I stutter? She said, settle down. She said, you better thank God the only problem Tammy ever caused us you can pull out with a payloader. And I'm telling you, I was rebuked. I went on my knees by Tammy's bed and asked forgiveness. I wrote her a note. Tammy didn't know what I was saying or thinking, but I'm sure she might have assumed, as firm as I was about that instruction, she might be thinking, where can I live the rest of my senior year? I'm not sure what was going on in her mind. But she never knew all of this till she heard me give this as an illustration a year later. And the wise words of a wise wife snapped me into attention to realize I was about to blow it again by an overreaction, by a self-centered focus. I was inconvenienced. Must we now deal with this, Moses said. And but the most hypocritical thing about this whole thing, the very next day, one of our faculty ladies had slipped off the road with that same ice problem. And she came into the dining hall crying, and I said, what's the problem? She said, I slipped off the road, and I said, and that can happen to anybody. That's not a problem. I said, anybody can do that. No, why did I do that to her? Instead of saying, can't you see ice? Because she could go back and say, boy, Doc, blew up. Go back. My reputation would be tainted. At home, my reputation was not tainted. My character was being revealed. And how careful we have to be in that regard, and how easy it is to become very hypocritical sometimes in our responses because we have been inconvenienced in that particular scenario. And when you look at that, so the countenance of anger, sarcastic words burst out many times. And we are instructed in Ephesians chapter 6 that we are not to provoke children to wrath. That's a clear instruction after the child is told to obey. We have to be very careful by an anger response that we do not provoke a child to go into wrath and cause that kind of a scenario. So what happens next? We see, thirdly, they were striking physically. And Moses lifted his hand and he smote the rock twice. And the water came out abundantly. The congregation drank, and their beast also. Now, what was God's instruction to him? God says, speak to the rock. In our next segment, I'm going to go very clearly into the problems that were caused, the calamity that came out of this step of disobedience. And I'm not saying I'm standing here critical of Moses. I'm simply expositing the passage. Because I would never have gotten as far as Moses got with those people. I don't know how many times Moses must have thought in his mind, I could have been the next Pharaoh. When I said, God called me, I said, I can. God says, I am. And Moses cried, God, show me your glory. Moses surrenders for the task. And from then on, it was pressure, pressure, pressure. And you stop to think, pardon my play on words here, but they gave Moses such a headache, God had to give him 2 tablets. And as we look at that play on words, you think every single headache that we face in leadership, God has given us the tablet of his word. There is an answer to that. But we are commanded to be filled with the Spirit and not to be reacting that way in the arm of the flesh. But what happened? He made a very clear step of disobedience, and he struck the rock twice in direct disobedience to what God had clearly commanded him to do. And we're going to see why that became such a serious matter and why there was such a serious judgment on this God-called leader, as I said earlier, the greatest leader in the Old Testament as far as I'm concerned. And yet here we find him being told by God, Moses, you can't go in. I will let you go up the mount and see into Canaan, but you will not go in. You dishonored me before the people. You cannot go in. What a serious matter that is. The wrath of man works not the pleasure of God. And yet many times we get so distraught. We get so personally pained. We get so frustrated with the role of responsibility that we forget the fact that we are to walk in complete obedience to what God's command very clearly is and what God very clearly says in that matter. So we look, he struck the rock. And that was in a fit of anger. And the Lord said unto Moses, because ye believed me not, ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land. This is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them. Moses died an early death. And I will very clearly, when I go into the calamity, and then what is the cure for anger in our next segment? What calamity does it cause? What cure for anger is there? And we will see very carefully why we are commanded to be filled with the Holy Spirit. That we are to have that patience demonstrated, and that patience worked. And if a great man like Moses, with so much strength, so much ability, so much responsibility, 600,000 fighting men, which meant there were probably 600,000 fighting women, and then you add to that 2 million screaming kids. It was not a small project that God gave to Moses. And yet Moses was still not able to just take it in his own hands, to make the choice to become disobedient, and in a fit of anger, dishonor God before the eyes of the people of Israel. What a lesson that is for us as leaders. Every statement that we make, every reaction that we have is a reflection of what is the character that is going on within us at that time. And we are to be filled, we are to be leading with love, we are to be leading with patience. And when we study the 15 verbal descriptions of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we begin to see the very convicting descriptions of what love really is, and how I as a leader, whether it's a dad or a mom or a corporate leader, has to be so careful how he acts and how he reacts in circumstances of life. Yes, there's personal pain. Yes, there would be people pressures. But yet we cannot take words in sarcasm. We cannot take a self-centered view of this. We have to be in God's place, because what happens, we will strike physically to great devastation many times.